Chapter 16. The first group of them arrived just before Christmas. Anne's own hopes had already been dashed. Master Charles had refused to write her a pass to visit her family over the holidays. He said he didn't trust that abolitionist Bigelow and would not let her out of his sight. That was when they came, with their own dashed hopes. They were connected to each other by chains around their necks. Some, with every step, left the snow tinged with blood from cracked and torn feet. Master Charles spoke with the white man who led them there. Money exchanged hands, and then the group of two men, a woman, and one young girl who looked to be a little older than Anne, was herded into the cellar through the outside flap doors. "I don't like this, Charles," Mistress Carroll said that evening as Anne served supper. "Once again, my dear, you know nothing of business. Clients must be able to contact me here as well as in Baltimore." "I know that what the ladies in this town think about your business," Mistress Carroll said. She wiped her mouth, but after her napkin had passed, the look of contempt was still there. Master Charles laughed harshly. "Of course. They own slaves, and they trust their husbands to buy them, but they hate the one who sells them. What hypocrites." There was uncomfortable silence at the dinner table. Sarah ate quietly, her eyes on her plate, and Anne returned to the kitchen. She'd heard Master Charles speak of his business. She knew he traveled to Baltimore almost every week, and often to Alexandria, but she had not suspected what was now apparent. He had become a slave trader. After dinner, Mistress Carroll folded some bread into a napkin and told Anne to take it to the cellar, along with a bucket of water. Anne opened the cellar door, balancing the bread and bucket in one hand and a candle in the other. As she stepped down the dark stairway, her shadow moved on the wall like a ghostly dancer. The cellar smelled of mildew and rotting potatoes. She heard whispers coming from the back corner, then shh, then silence. She lifted the candle above her head and saw first the feet. Some were bare, some wrapped in rags, but all were shackled around the ankles with chains. Anne blinked and shook her head, not wanting to believe what she saw. The thin-nosed workmen had not been repairing broken steps or mending a crumbling foundation. They had attached chains and shackles to the walls, and in the corner they'd installed a whipping post. She stood motionless. The group sat on the cold, damp floor without a single blanket among them. "What have you got there? It smells good," one of the men said finally. Anne dropped to her knees and began to break the bread into 4 portions. "It's not much," she said. "Tomorrow I'll bring you a good breakfast whether they tell me to or not." "Much obliged, miss," said the woman, her mouth full of bread. Her face was broad under a white head wrap. "This here is Richmond and Theophilus, and this is Martha, and I'm Nancy," she said, and then set into a frightful fit of coughing. Anne offered her a dipper full of water, and it eased her cough. "Do they feed you decent here?" asked Theophilus. His hat was pulled down low, and he looked as if he'd be tall and lanky if he stood. "Most times," Anne answered. "That's good," said Richmond. "My old master down in North Carolina, name of Jesse Moore, didn't hardly feed us. He's as bad as they come. Couldn't be any worse to be alive." He stuffed his mouth hungrily. He reminded Anne of Joseph, with his bright eyes and quick movements. Sickeningly, she realized that all 3 of her brothers might have been chained in dark basements like this one on their way south. "My master wasn't too bad," Theophilus was saying, "but he hired me out to Master Houston. Master Houston was a hard man. If you didn't eat breakfast before daybreak, he'd drive you out in the field to work all day with no breakfast at all." Anne saw that the bread had nearly disappeared in 2 mouthfuls. She wished she'd thought to save part of her own supper to smuggle to them. "Master Cahill, he fed us good," said Nancy. She pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "And I grew sweet potatoes and fried them up on Sundays." They passed the bucket of water, and each used the ladle to drink. Nancy leaned forward and glanced around furtively. "Anybody here ever run away?" Richmond gave a quick laugh. "I runned once, a few years back. With a master like Jesse Moore, a man can hardly not think of running." He cured me of it good, though. He rubbed his feet and winced. How long did you stay away? Theophilus asked. Richmond grinned. 4 months. Best 4 months of my life. I lived in the swamp and ate better on squirrels and berries than I'd ever ate at Master Moore's place. He leaned his head back against the wall, remembering, and I was free. What happened? Anne asked, not sure she wanted to know. Richmond shrugged. The hunters finally catched me. When Master Moore got hold of me, he whipped me 100 lashes. My back was tore up and the blood running, and he took his knife and slit both my feet clear to the bone, here and here. He pointed to the underside of his arch and the back of his ankle above the heel. In the dim light, Anne could see raised scars. Her belly quivered at the thought of the pain. Richmond continued, Then he took that old knife and stabbed me with it. In my arms, my legs, my chest, my stomach, the blood was running everywhere. And do you know what that man did? He sent me to the barn to shuck a pile of corn. Lord have mercy, Nancy cried. It's a miracle you lived. Theophilus nodded solemnly. A miracle, he echoed. I'm glad he sold me, said Richmond. Can't hardly be a man worse than Master Moore. Anne felt queasy and shaken. I hope you get a better master, she said very softly. I do too, miss, said Richmond. I do too. Theophilus nodded and helped himself to more water. I hear if we get sold in Maryland or Virginia, it's easy to go north from here, he said. Nancy shook her head. I've lived in Virginia all my life and wasn't nothing easy to get away from there. But I hear sometimes folks can help you, said Theophilus. Quakers and such. Said Nancy. She raised her eyebrows and puckered her lips. And sometimes those folks get themselves in big trouble. Did you hear about that white man named of Seth Conklin tried to help a family from Alabama to freedom? No one had, so she continued. He was carrying them on a boat up the river toward Canada. They got all the way to Indiana. That's where the slave catchers got them. The family, they told the authorities they'd been kidnapped and they got sent back to their master in Alabama without any trouble. But do you know what they did to that white man? Everybody shook their heads. Nancy lowered her voice. They found him floating in the river with his hands and feet in chains and his skull crushed. Lord, Anne whispered. She felt the blood drain from her face. They didn't even give him a trial? Theophilus tapped the tips of his fingers together. Sounds to me like they gave him his trial, his verdict, and his sentence all right there on the riverbank. And his grave, Nancy added sadly. The candle flickered and hissed. Footsteps clattered on the floor over their heads, and Anne wondered if someone would be calling her soon. Nancy sighed heavily. Well, I'm not glad to leave my old master, and I would not have run away either. I'd have given anything to be able to stay with my mother and brother, my husband and my baby. Her voice broke, and she held one hand over her mouth for a moment. But as soon as Master Cahill died, the mistress got it in her mind to start selling. And with me being so sickly and no good in the fields, she decided she'd rather not have me around to feed. She sniffled and wiped her nose on her shawl. Anne felt a tightness in her chest. I have left my whole family too, she wanted to say. But she was afraid if she tried to speak, she would only cry. Martha had not yet spoken. She sat listening, her eyes fearful, her thin fingers laced around her knees. What about you, Miss Martha? Asked Theophilus. Did your old master treat you all right? I have no old master, said Martha quietly. I have always been free, living in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. A hush came over the huddled group. Why are you here then? Asked Anne. 3 white men came to my house in the night. They lifted me from my bed and carried me out. I screamed and screamed, and my father fought them, but they threw him to the ground and took me away in a carriage. They sold me to a man who brought me here. I tried to tell him I'd been kidnapped, but he said he'd paid good money for me, and it didn't matter. How horrible, Anne exclaimed. That ain't right, said Richmond. It's against the law, said Nancy. And not a one of us can help her, said Theophilus. Unless a white person testifies, it doesn't matter what crime a black person, slave or free, has seen. The door to the cellar creaked, and Sarah's timid voice came from the top of the steps. Aunt Carol says it's time for you to put me to bed. Anne rose quickly and picked up the candle. Then, thoughtfully, she placed the candle back on the dirt floor. She had no blankets, no meat, no key to unlock their chains, and no hopeful words for them. The least she could do was leave them with light. Later that night, as Anne fell asleep, through the floorboards, she heard Martha weeping.